I recently did a video talking about the first two Pillars of Eternity games, Pillars of Eternity 1 Pillars of Eternity 2, Deadfire, and I asked the question, do you need to play those games to get the most out of Avowed? And I think at the end of the day, you don't. But if you are someone who loves lore and the setting and you want to know more about the world of Eora, which is the world that Obsidian Entertainment created in the first two games, as the setting that Avowed is taking place in, then I do think you need to play those games, but you might not have the time to do so. That's where this video comes in, because we're going to be talking everything you need to know about the setting of Eora before you actually jump in and play Avowed. Because, it's kind of like Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 were kind of like Obsidian's love letter back to that old isometric RPG genre that we grew up with games like, Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, Icewind Dale 1 and 2, even Neverwinter Nights 1 and 2. But Avowed is much different in the sense that it's going to be a Skyrim style game. But the setting is what we're interested here in talking about today. So if you're along for that ride, awesome. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you never miss an update as we continue to talk about Avowed, Baldur's Gate 3, Starfield, all these other games that we're playing here on my channel. So, yeah, let's dive in. So the world of Eora is fairly conventional as far as fantasy worlds go. You've got your magic system, you've got your elves and your dwarves and your humans, but there are also a few things that are different about Avowed because we've got some races that don't, show up in other games, and there are some classes that don't show up in other places. The setting itself is fairly large. We haven't seen a lot of it, is the interesting thing. Kind of like if you look at the way BioWare has been slowly doling out bits and pieces of the world around the Dragon Age games and the setting that that world takes place in. We have something very similar here. We've seen, as an example, the Deerwood, which was the main setting of Pillars of Eternity, the first game. That was a former colony of Adir, which was an empire mostly comprised of humans and elves, right along the equator of Eora. It's also the hotspot of Animancy, which was this complicated magic system with souls and other stuff that took place during the first game. There's also the Occidental Plains north of the Deerwood, which is sort of like open savannas where the Orlans come from, as well as some humans. There's also Old Valia and the Valian Republics, which were once sort of like the great big seafaring country and nation. We of course saw the Deadfire Archipelago in Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire, which is a bunch of tropical islands, some of them volcanic, which were mainly occupied by the Amawa. And then there's the Rawatai, which is a resource-rich land that's constantly being squabbled over. And of course, the White That Wins, which is the polar region at the bottom of the world, which is primarily home to the Pale Elves and Boreal Dwarves. But the setting for Avowed is apparently taking place in a part of the world called the Living Lands, which we haven't really seen a lot of yet, just other than being mentioned in the first couple of games. Apparently, it's a northern frontier island with fantastical beasts, unpredictable weather, and a whole bunch of stuff that no one's ever seen before, like mortal eyes have never seen. Now, we can assume that we're going to get the same diversity of races in the Living Lands as we've seen in other places within Eora, but of course, we don't know exactly what's coming in the pipeline yet with the way they're doing character creation in Avowed. But I would anticipate that we're going to be able to see all of the races that we saw during the previous two games making their appearance here, and who knows, there might be something new. Speaking of races, the ones that you can think of as the standard I kind of mentioned before, like the elves, humans, and dwarves, but we've also got the Amawa, which we mentioned earlier. Now, these are these massive, I mean, for human standards, maybe they're not massive, but they are a larger race of humanoids, and they're known for their strength and affinity for water, which, being the Deadfire Archipelago is where we saw them mostly, and all their rich cultures in Deadfire. Now, the Kith are it's basically everybody. It's a collective term for the humanoid races of Kith. And out of all of these, there's also the Orlans, which are unique to Pillars of Eternity. Now, these are kind of like, I guess you could consider them gnomes or halflings, I guess. But they have their own backstory, which is very interesting. And the thing I love about Obsidian Entertainment is they don't shy away from having a race in their game that were persecuted, because the Orlans have suffered a ton of prejudice over the years and poor treatment as slaves and otherwise at the hands of other kith within the world. But be that as it may, they have managed to come through it and are one of the playable races that you can do in Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2. And they, of course, we also have the Godlike, which are descended from any of the Kith races, but their appearances and abilities have been modified based on which one of the gods of Eora that they associate with. So there's usually some weird things that happen with their bodies and head shapes, and if you're tied to Earth, you might have like a tree-looking form. If you're tied to fire, you might have something that looks fire. There's lots of different things, and the weird thing about godlike is it kind of depends on where you're at in the world, but they can either be revered or reviled. And while there's some in between, they're so different in their appearance that it's kind of terrifying to most people. But you got things like, moon, fire, earth, avian, death, so on and so forth. That's what we've seen so far. We don't know if we're going to get any more in the new game. Now, one of the most interesting parts about the world of Eora is the reincarnation component. So they've got this thing called the wheel, which is a natural phenomenon responsible for a cycle, this cycle of reincarnation, which allows souls to pass from one life into another. And this event continued on for thousands of years throughout the history of the world of Eora until eventually we get to a race of people known as the Anguithans, which was a basically humanoids, humans, but they were a civilization that came before the current people who inhabit the planet. Now, the Anguithans seized control of this reincarnation process. They seized control of the wheel by building this great machine at the heart of Ukaizo. And this actually disrupted the natural cycle of reincarnation to the point that that cycle began to rely purely upon the machines to function. And this is something that's told more in the story of Deadfire, but also somewhat in the first game as well, because that's the whole reason it's sort of like why animancy sprung up. And there's this whole thing of like kids are being born without souls because they've screwed it all up with the machines. And it's a really cool story point. And the first game takes a lot of time in establishing that unique system, and also the gods, which are a lot different than other deities in fantasy worlds, given that these deities weren't necessarily born into it, if that makes sense. Commercial time, everyone. Huge shout out to the Guild Champions, who are our highest tiered membership here on YouTube. We've got Bubbleonia, Ancient Entity, Crazy's Relative, Remy D. Thanks so much for your support here on the channel. And of course, to all of our members who help keep me full time here on YouTube. Thanks so much for your support, for being here, for checking in. Don't forget to like, subscribe, hit that bell icon, super chat any live streams or premieres you see, super thanks any video uploads you see. Don't forget YouTube Shorts in that category as well. And hopefully, we'll see you in the next live stream. Don't forget the Discord. Links are down below. Let's get back to the video. Now, the state of the world, at least as of the time at the end of Deadfire, which is the second game in the series, the Wheel of Reincarnation was actually smashed to pieces by the god Aothas. That was part of the storyline that you were working on in that game, was tracking down Aothas and figuring out what he was going to be doing, which in all essence is just completely, you know, took the system of reincarnation and threw it on its head and completely just fried it. And basically, the reasoning for this was because he saw that it was a broken system and he wanted to get rid of their reliance upon it until such time as they could figure out how to make it work for themselves. So at the end of Deadfire, we've left Eora in this state where it's sort of like ripe for rebuilding, which means there's a lot of directions that Obsidian could choose to take things based upon the chaos that the gods created during this event. But we also don't know whether or not Avowed is taking place in a post Deadfire world or a pre Deadfire world. It could be taking place before Pillars of Eternity. But the Living Lands could also be so far away from the rest of the known world that they might not even mention any of the previous games. Um, Happenings, which is going to be an interesting thing to look at because we just don't know yet where the game is being set in terms of the world events. Now, the Living Lands being so different means that we're probably going to see completely different factions and political systems compared to what we saw in the first two games, which was one of the things I really loved about the first game was we saw one political system because the game was set there in the Deerwood, and then we saw, when we get to the Deadfire, we get to the archipelago, and that has a completely different system of politics and cultures because we're dealing with the Amoa instead of the humans. So we just don't know what's going on here. It could be completely untamed without any civilization. We just don't know yet enough about the Living Lands. And we also don't know if there's a limit on playable races or if there's been any changes to the classes that we've seen so far or how the magic system works because all of that was sort of established in the first two games, but those were isometric games that played very much like the old isometric, and they were based on tabletops. So given the fact that we're working with more of a Skyrim style game, we don't know if we're going to be dealing with the same mechanics or if they're going to be doing something completely different. We also don't know if they're going to be going with a class-based system or a skill-based system. It's a very interesting place where we are. So at the end of the day, Avowed has more than enough room to sort of stand on its own two legs as its own thing, just being set in the same world of Eora, which is why I said in my other video, I don't think you necessarily need to have played Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 to be able to get the most out of Avowed, but you're certainly going to be able to have a greater understanding of any of the races and things that you might come across in the game if you've played the first two. But if not, that's what this primer edition is here for, to help get you guys up to speed. So with that being said, hopefully you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon, and stick around because we've got a lot more coming in the pipeline, not just with Avowed, but also with, Baldur's Gate 3, we've got Starfield, we still continue to play Lord of the Rings Online, Star Wars: The Old Republic, and of course we have all the TV shows and book reviews and everything else we do on the channel. So hopefully we'll see you for all the other stuff we do, and of course don't forget the Discord. Until next time, everybody, stay safe and happy viewing.